You have such a long history with President Obama, all the way from his Senate days to the White House. As someone who worked in government, in a government that actually worked, actually functioned, got things done, wasn't overtaken by crisis, I'm curious just your kind of gut emotional feeling of watching all of this craziness unravel, given your experiences and your insight. I mean, how do you make it through the day?
I've been tweeting lately with the hashtag amateur hour, and I think that even probably gives these guys more credit. First of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. You know, I was with President Obama for a long time. We're actually law school classmates. Was with
Were
him.
you friends in law school?
We were acquaintances in law school, and as I said earlier, we're also in the same law school class with Neil Gorsuch, and Neil and I actually are friends, and so that's a odd dynamic. I ran President Obama's transition in 2008, and by all accounts, that was the best-run transition in recent history. And you saw the product of that in the successful first 100 days, first year of our administration. Everything that is happening in this administration right now could be traced back to the fact that these guys never thought they were going to win, never planned that they were going to win, and then haven't actually along the way. Just the simple blocking and tackling of how you manage an administration, they just can't seem to get right.
Now, isn't the real problem here is that he can't attract talent? He can't attract, well, there's two problems, right? One is he can't attract staff talent who actually know how to do this, how to plan, how to roll out initiatives. And then he just is an unpredictable mess who undermines anything those trained paid professionals would do. And so those two big problems just results in what we're seeing now.
Yeah, if you go back to the campaign, I mean, he didn't have a large group of policy people around him. To the extent that people had policy views, there was this whole group of never-Trumpers. So there's a whole group of the Republican establishment that was aligned against him. He comes into office without a bench of people. What he should have done at that point was to say to these folks, look, I'm now the president. I know you all did not want to serve with me. I want to extend the olive branch. If you want to serve, I'm happy to have you serve. But everything about Donald Trump's background has been blind loyalty. If you have ever wronged him in some way, he's going to get back at you, whether it's now Jeff Bezos, whether it's Joe Scarborough or Jeff Sessions, apparently, over the last couple of days. So it's this adherence to blind loyalty that has limited his ability to not only get qualified people, but to get the advice of the people that are actually serving him. So that's one issue. But then you saw over the last 2 weeks, when he first floated this idea, well, we're going to create this cyber unit with Russia. He floats it out on Twitter. He sends Mnuchin out to defend it. And then like 12 hours later, he pulls it back. In any normal White House, you run something like that through the National Security Council process. And to the extent the president makes an announcement about it, it gets carefully vetted through the White House press and communications operation. There's a process to ensure that you don't stick not only your neck out there, but the neck of your Treasury Secretary, and then yank it out or lop it off at the last minute. It is a nutty White House. I served in the Obama White House for the first 4 years. Even in the best of times, it is incredibly chaotic. But when you have a president who is calling audibles every single moment, by all accounts, the interview he did with the New York Times, if you believe the press accounts, only Hope Hicks knew that he was going to do this. You've got a new lawyer named Ty Cobb who is coming in to sort of corral everyone to make sure the communications doesn't interfere with the legal strategy. And then you have the president out there now opining about Russia, his son, without checking with anyone. You can't function in that White House.
Yeah, it's a real problem, clearly, and it's the reason why in the first 6 months of the Trump administration, he hasn't accomplished any of his major goals that he set out to do. So when it comes to healthcare, it's like, great. But, for his supporters who voted for him because they may have believed the promise that he's going to really shake up the system, that he's a businessman who knows how to get things done, it's a real problem. But I also wonder what it does to this notion that I think progressives are constantly fighting, and that is to make sure that people understand that we can make government work for them, that government can in fact work to improve people's lives. What we now have this clown circus show of a government that can't get anything done, that certainly can't help the people who need help the most. Do you think that kind of complicates and sets back the effort, kind of the struggle that progressive Democrats face of convincing people that government can improve their lives?
I think I was in the Obama administration for 7 out of 8 years. We came very close to shutting down the federal government several times. I think the big mistake we always made was we would exempt critical services from a potential shutdown. I think that was a mistake because I think the American people need to know how government affects their lives every moment of the day. And in a potential shutdown, if the only way you're going to be affected is you can't go to a national park, that doesn't affect enough people. You need to shut down VA benefits and TSA security at airports. The military needs to stop. I think that's the problem. Government touches American people's lives every single moment of the day, but it's not apparent to them until it stops functioning. And I think what you're going to start to see over the next, it'll only be 3.5 more years, is the continuing degradation of government. A couple examples. State Department, there are only 2 assistant secretaries who have been nominated out of 22. That will have an effect on our ability to conduct foreign policy. Virtually no ambassadors are in place right now. We are in hurricane season right now. There is no FEMA administrator. There is no TSA administrator. So government can function with career employees until there is a crisis. And the one thing from working in the White House is the unpredictability of crises. And when that happens, you need competent leadership. And the American people are going to see very dramatically what it means that this is a president who can't manage the government.
Chris, as you reflect on your 4 years in the White House, what is something you're most proud of in accomplishing that kind of exemplifies President Trump's approach to governance, which is to go through all the processes, plan things out in order to push through a major initiative?
Well, healthcare is the one that I'm as proud about as anything, and obviously
took a while.
It took a while. We went through about a year-long process to try to find Republican support in both the House and Senate.
Do you think that was a mistake? Let's get into that. Do you think that allowing a senator like Max Baucus to spend 3 months trying to build consensus within his committee, the Senate Finance Committee, he was chair at the time, and try to bring Republicans on board during a time when in 2008, 2009, Republicans like Chuck Grassley were out there saying, I support the individual mandate. People should take responsibility for their own health care costs. He did get ultimately Olympia Snowe to vote for the Senate Finance Bill in committee. But of course, Republicans eventually, seeing a poll from Frank Luntz that said, hey, look, you get a lot more political bang for your buck by opposing everything Obama does than supporting it, ultimately said, we're not going to go along with what the president wants, and of course have built a wall of opposition that stretches from that point in time in 2009 to today of trying to tear down the law. But I'm curious to hear if you think that the president's approach there, the Democrat approach, in passing the law and trying to find compromise and dragging the process out in some ways made it harder ultimately for them to both do good policy but also sell it to the public.
Look, obviously hindsight is 2020, and if you go back to 2009 following President Obama's election, I think there really was a sense not only in Washington but in this country that we could move to a post-partisan period in our country, and clearly that wasn't the case. We actually had a filibuster-proof majority for a period of that time, not the entire time, but we had a filibuster. So we could have actually passed it on a straight party line vote. President Obama's instincts are always to reach across the aisle, and I think about this a lot, given the news of Senator McCain. We worked very closely with Senator McCain's office in the Senate when we were there on ethics reform, on immigration reform. Barack Obama's instincts are to reach across the aisle. And look, we tried, again, the $800 billion stimulus is another one that we got passed without a single Republican vote. Look, if we could go back in history, should we have done it on a party line vote? Probably. We should have probably done immigration reform the exact same way. I think the theory was that if we tried to reach across the aisle, we could kind of build this permanent Democratic majority, which of course didn't happen, and we've seen the results of that.
Yeah, I mean, the president, this shouldn't surprise people. I don't think. You read some of his early book before he ran for president, What Dreams of My Father. He lays out his theory fairly clearly, and exactly as you described, that will reach out across the aisle, and with discussion and communication, we can form consensus, find the best solution from both sides, and move forward into policy. And that works in, a book, but in a situation where the other side just will never work with you, and no matter what you do, you can give them and design a policy that was developed by the Heritage Foundation and implemented by a Republican governor in Massachusetts, and they will still say no to it.
Yeah.
When he got pushback on that idea in strategy sessions of, maybe somebody said to him, Mr. President, Republicans just won't work with you. Maybe we should develop a different path to get this done. Would he push back and say, no, let's keep on trying? Or how did he, I guess, weigh the reality of the fact that Republicans just weren't going to help at all?
And I think the hard part is, and it's amazing how much has just changed in 8 or 12 years. I mean, if you go back to 2005, for instance, when we were in the Senate, an immigration reform bill got out of the U.S. Senate with a significant number of Republican votes. And you've now seen how the evolution of the Republican Party just simply over the last dozen years or so. I mean, I'm now making excuses clearly, but if you go back and look at the dynamics in 2009, 2010, it was not only Max Baucus, it was Joe Lieberman. There were a fair number of Democrats in the Senate who were not going to go for a single payer plan, who wanted to reach across the aisle. We also had back in the day blue dog Democrats in the House who wanted to try to find common grounds. Now, obviously, many of those don't exist anymore. Look, in the current political climate, clearly we would have taken a different approach back in 2009, 2010, where you have a president who really was trying to rise above party and to turn the country in a different direction. I don't disagree with the direction he took at that point. Did it come up with the best policy? Probably not. The reality, though, is that if you look at any major piece of legislation, whether it's Medicare or Medicaid, the first iteration is never the final iteration. You need to go through a successive period of times to fix it. And that's what we should be doing right now, not repealing it.
I think an interesting question when you reflect on President Obama's years in office, the kind of opposition that Republicans put up, really, saying no to everything. What lessons do you think Democrats today, people like Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, the House Democratic leader, can learn from what Republicans did? Because in many ways they were successful in tearing down the president's agenda in many respects.
Merrick Garland being a perfect example.
Merrick Garland, your friend Merrick, being a perfect example. But, you got to be careful here, obviously, because, I think Democrats, and there's now this sense, I feel, and tell me if you're not hearing it, out in the country, that we know that Democrats oppose Donald Trump. We know that they oppose all his policies, his ideas. But what do they stand for, right? And there's now this effort by Democrats, by think tanks around town, of trying to develop a real progressive agenda, which in some ways is different than what Republicans did. How do you balance those two between saying no to everything, but also maybe being open, and healthcare might be an example of doing some bipartisan work to, for instance, stabilize the health markets?
Well, I also am fortunate to have worked with Tom Perez for the last 3 years, our new chairman of the DNC when he was the Secretary of Labor, and I know he's spending a lot of time now coming up with an affirmative agenda. And let's be honest, Hillary Clinton had an affirmative agenda. She talked about better wages, better jobs. She talked about paid leave. She talked about a lot of things that are on the minds of people, but the press never paid attention to that. They were more interested in the back and forth of the campaign between her and Donald Trump. So for everyone who says progressives need an agenda, we have an agenda. But it's hard to get through the filter.
But people appear not to know about it, right? So you look at the ABC Washington news poll from, Saturday,
right. 2
findings. Everybody hates Trump. Nobody knows what Democrats are actually for.
But I would say this. Look, I was in the Senate in 2006 when Democrats took back both the House and Senate on a message that was nothing other than we don't like George Bush's war in Iraq. We didn't really have another message. We didn't have a better approach.
We didn't like the war.
I was in the White House in 2010 when Republicans took back the House based on, hey, we don't like Obamacare. We didn't have another proposal. So I don't minimize the anti-Trump as enough of a force to take us to help us win back the House and potentially the Senate in 2018. I think that's a very powerful force. But you're right. As we move into 2020, we need to better lay out the strategy for what the party stands for. That being said, if you go back and look at 2005, right after Bush gets reelected, you would not have said, "Hey, it's a slam dunk that Democrats are going to take back the White House 3 years later." A lot of things change along the way, and whether it's events here or events at home, overseas, and so sometimes the message comes with the messenger itself, which was Barack Obama.
Do you think Democrats should be embracing really kind of bold progressive policies like single payer, for instance, when it comes to healthcare? Should that be part of the platform moving forward? It feels like we're in a time with Democrats out of power that this is a time to grow the progressive base in the same way that Republicans spend their out years growing the conservative base. And certainly the party has moved far to the right than it was under President Bush. But should Democrats, I guess, be embracing these kinds of bold ideas that may not have the baked-in compromises of here's how we'll get to 51 or 60 votes or whatever the case may be, but really kind of aspirational ideas of where they want to see the country move?
Look, I don't know where I stand on whether this country is politically ready for single payer. I will say that there's a fascinating story in today's New York Times that sort of talks about folks they interviewed on Obamacare back in 2010 in Trump country and coming back to them. And they're now like, look, we didn't think this was the right thing back then. We now think it's the right thing. And when you look at the poll numbers, there is now a growing recognition, not only just among Democrats, but among Republicans and independents, that not only should government play a more active role in healthcare, but that everyone has a right to healthcare. And that may be ultimately the legacy of the Affordable Care Act, that basically putting the presumption that everyone should have a right to healthcare. Now, how we eventually accomplish that is a much more difficult question.
Well, I say let's get everyone to the system, and then we'll figure out how to pay for it.